It's funny, isn't it? You can, really care about biodiversity in Europe, see all the reports, feel the urgency,
Mm.
but then the actual solutions, they often feel like they're happening somewhere else entirely, like miles away in Brussels maybe, or deep inside scientific labs.
Yeah, that feeling of disconnect is pretty common, I think. We hear a lot about the policies, the big research findings,
Right.
but how that actually translates into, real change on the ground, that part can feel a bit fuzzy.
Exactly. And that's actually why this recent study by Diamato and colleagues really caught my eye.
Ah, the network analysis one.
That's the one. They didn't just look at, say, specific endangered species or habitat loss figures. No, they stepped back.
They looked at the system itself.
Yes, the network, the organizations, the people who are actually supposed to be working together on European biodiversity.
And what's really interesting, like you said, is how they looked at it using social network analysis.
Explain that a bit. What does that actually mean in practice?
Well, uh, think of it like mapping out the relationships. Who talks to whom? Who shares information?
Okay.
So instead of just cataloging what each group does, this one does research, that one makes policy. They looked at how connected they are, how they interact.
Got it. So the key question becomes, in this whole European biodiversity, space scientists, policymakers, NGOs, businesses, all of them, who's actually
Yeah,
connected?
precisely. And are those connections strong? Are they effective?
And what they found, it suggests that
Yeah,
maybe those connections aren't as strong as we'd hope.
that seemed to be the core finding, yeah. It points towards a network that's surprisingly fragmented.
Fragmented,
Uh,
even though there's loads of scientific knowledge out there.
exactly. We have, a deep understanding of many biodiversity issues in Europe, but the pathways for that knowledge to actually flow, to get from the scientists to the policymakers to the people on the ground,
They're not always clear. Or maybe they're blocked.
or just not well coordinated. This study paints this picture of, like, imagine a brilliant orchestra full of incredibly talented musicians. You've got your scientific experts, your policy writers, your conservation teams doing amazing work.
Right, all the key players.
But if they're not quite listening to each other, not quite in sync, not coordinating their parts effectively,
Then the final piece, the overall result, might sound a bit off.
it might not be as powerful or coherent as it could be. That's the analogy anyway.
So, what does that fragmentation actually mean in practice? Are we talking missed opportunities, maybe people doing the same work without realizing it?
That's a really important question. And yes, fragmentation can definitely lead to delays.
Mm.
Delays in getting research findings into policy or into action on the ground.
Mm.
And you absolutely could have different groups, well-meaning groups, working on similar problems but sort of in their own silos, which isn't the most efficient way to do things.
All right.
The study actually dug into this by looking at, I think it was 215 organizations.
215, that's quite a few. What sorts of groups were included in that?
It was a real mix. You had the big EU players like DG Environment, the European Environment
The
Agency.
usual suspects at the EU level.
Yes. And global platforms too, like
Mm.
IPPES.
Mm.
But also, crucially, lots of other types of organizations. NGOs, research bodies, even private sector groups, think forestry companies, agricultural associations.
Okay, so a really broad spectrum. And did they find patterns in who was talking to whom?
They did. One interesting finding was that the organizations that were most connected, the sort of central hubs in the network,
Yeah.
they tended to be the ones with direct links to the EU, which perhaps isn't totally surprising given how much is policy-driven.
That makes a certain amount of sense, yeah. But I remember the study also talked about the importance of bridge organizations. What are those?
Ah, yes, the bridges. These are really critical. They're the groups that connect different parts of the network that might not otherwise interact much.
So connecting the EU hub to maybe more local groups or different sectors.
Exactly. The study really highlighted the role played here by certain private organizations, and particularly those involved in actually managing landscapes.
Like who specifically?
Think about, say, private forestry managers, or groups managing wetlands, or maybe even farming cooperatives, people dealing directly with the land.
How do they act as a bridge, though? Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a private forestry company. They might be actively following the latest science on sustainable logging or habitat preservation within forests.
Okay.
They take that science, maybe translate it into practical changes in how they manage their own land. But then they might also be talking to local environmental NGOs about monitoring biodiversity in those forests.
Ah, I see. So they're connecting the science to the practice and also connecting with other stakeholders like the NGOs.
Precisely. That interaction, taking knowledge, applying it, and engaging others, that's a vital bridging function. They're almost like translators in a way.
Translators, yeah. Taking the complex language of science or policy and making it, well, real and actionable for people on the ground.
That's a good way to put it.
Now, the study also talked about identifying 4 main clusters within this big network. Let's unpack those a bit. The first one was called EU Policy and Science Collaboration.
Right. This cluster's pretty much what it sounds like. It's mainly research institutions and the parts of the EU administration that are heavily involved in drafting biodiversity policy.
So their main job is generating the data and analysis, providing the evidence base for EU decisions.
Exactly. You could call them the data people, maybe. Their focus is on research that directly informs those high-level policy choices.
Okay. Then cluster number 2, the agriculture and forestry community.
Yeah, these are the folks, as you said earlier, who are kind of making policies real.
The ones on the ground, farmers, forest managers.
The people and organizations directly managing farmland, forests, those kinds of landscapes, they're the ones who have to implement biodiversity policies in their daily work. Their focus is often very practical, very implementation-oriented.
Makes sense. Third cluster, natural capital and sustainable development. This sounds like where economics meets environment.
That's right. This group is focused on that intersection. They're working on ways to value ecosystems in economic terms, trying to integrate what's called natural capital into business decisions and broader sustainable development plans.
Putting a price on nature, essentially, or at least valuing its services.
Something like that, yeah. Finding ways to make the economic case for protecting biodiversity.
And the fourth cluster.
That was the public engagement and conservation groups. So this is where you find many of the NGOs, community conservation projects, groups doing habitat restoration, wildlife charities, and also those focused on raising public awareness.
Okay, so 4 quite distinct groups, it sounds like, each with its own focus, its own language almost.
They often have different priorities and ways of working, yes. And the study's big point was that these clusters, well, they need to connect more across the boundaries.
Break down the silos, that old chestnut.
It really seems crucial here. The study argues strongly for finding ways to get these different clusters talking and, importantly, collaborating much more effectively.
Did they suggest how? What were some of the specific ideas for getting, say, the data people talking to the conservation groups?
One key thing was fostering more direct links between the scientists, Cluster 1, and the NGOs in Cluster 4.
Why is that important?
Well, it could help make sure the science being done is really relevant to what conservationists actually need on the ground. And just as importantly, the experiences and knowledge from the ground could flow back to inform the research agenda, make it a two-way street.
That makes sense. Any other connections they highlighted?
Yes, they also really stressed involving businesses more and policymakers from areas beyond just environment, like agriculture, finance, regional development. And of course, landowners themselves need to be part of these conversations. It can't just be the usual environmental crowd talking to each other.
Which sounds like a perfect lead-in to this upcoming EU science service for biodiversity, is the idea that this could be one of those bridging mechanisms.
It certainly has the potential, yes. A dedicated service like that could really help connect the dots and create a more integrated network.
But there's a catch, I imagine.
The catch, or maybe the crucial factor, is inclusivity. For it to really work and improve the situation the study describes, this new service needs to genuinely bring all these different actors to the table.
Not just the scientists and the EU policymakers who are already quite central.
Exactly. It needs to actively involve the NGOs, the land managers, the business representatives, all those different perspectives from the 4 clusters. If it manages that, it could be a really positive step.
Because ultimately, and this seems to be the core message coming through from the study, protecting biodiversity isn't just about having the best science or the cleverest policies on paper.
No, it's fundamentally about people. It's about the relationships between those people and organizations. It's about how they share knowledge, how they build trust, how they collaborate.
Or fail to collaborate, perhaps.
Or fail to, yes.
Yeah.
Effective strategies need that interconnected web. They need open communication, diverse voices coming together. You can't just develop them in one corner and expect them to work perfectly across the whole system.
So, for you listening, It doesn't really matter what your specific role is. Maybe you're working in policy, maybe you're a researcher, maybe an activist, maybe you run a farm or a business, or maybe you're just someone who cares deeply about the planet.
Mm-hmm.
This research is relevant because it gets under the hood, doesn't it? It looks at the mechanisms of how things get done or don't get done. It highlights why just having good information isn't always enough.
Absolutely. It shows that the strength of the connections, the quality of the relationships between everyone involved is just as vital, maybe even more vital sometimes, for turning knowledge and good intentions into actual, tangible impact on the ground.
Which leaves us with a bit of a challenge, perhaps. A final thought to consider. Well, it prompts you, the listener, to think about your own field, doesn't it? Whatever area you work in or care about, especially concerning environmental action. We often focus so much on the what, the data, the targets, the specific actions.
True, the content of the work.
But this study really pushes us to think about the how, the structure. How are the different players in your area connected? Who's talking to whom? Are there voices missing? Are there bridges that need building?
And to ask, what more could be achieved if those connections were stronger, if those networks were more inclusive and, well, less fragmented? It's a really important structural question to ask beyond the day-to-day focus.